Salt air carries the smell of cedar resin and fish guts across the harbor. Merchant ships crowd the dock, unloading amphorae of wine and bolts of linen. Children chase each other between the legs of sailors who have spent months at sea. The sun cuts low across the water, and for a moment, this Mediterranean port feels like the center of the world. Somewhere in Athens, around 360 BC, a philosopher sits down to write. He is not a historian, not a geographer or a sailor. He is Plato, and the story he is about to tell will occupy the human imagination for the next 2,400 years and counting. He describes an island empire beyond the edge of the known world, a civilization more powerful than anything that existed in his time, advanced, wealthy, morally perfect until it wasn't, and then in a single night of fire and flood, swallowed by the sea without a trace. No ruins, no artifacts, not a single shard of physical evidence, and yet people have never stopped looking. Researchers have mapped the Atlantic floor, excavated the Spanish coastline, pointed cameras at a geological formation in the Saharan desert, and declared they'd found it. Documentaries have been made, books published by the thousands, careers devoted to a single search. People still submit papers to archaeology conferences about an island that most archaeologists are completely certain never existed. That's the strange part. It's not that people believed in Atlantis a long time ago and gradually came to their senses. Belief has grown, the obsession has deepened. The searches get more sophisticated every decade, and the claims get wilder. Why? What is it about one unfinished story, written by one man who may have invented all of it, that refuses to stay buried? Athens, 360 BC. The city is past its golden age. The great victories against Persia are a century old. The Parthenon stands finished, already aging. Athens has lost a devastating war against Sparta, watched its democratic ideals corrode under factional violence, and executed its most celebrated citizen, Socrates, for the crime of asking too many uncomfortable questions. Into this bruised city steps Plato, student of Socrates, teacher of Aristotle, one of the sharpest minds the ancient world ever produced. He has spent decades building an elaborate philosophical system, written about justice, the ideal state, the nature of the soul. He is not a historian. He is not trying to preserve a factual record of anything. He is trying to change how people think. Around 360 BC, he composes two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, written as philosophical conversations between a group of educated Athenians. Timaeus opens with a long cosmological lecture on the structure of the universe. Critias picks up the thread and is where the island story lives. Neither is presented as a history text. They're debates, thought experiments, the kind of intellectual exercise that ran constantly through the Athenian philosophical tradition. And the Atlantis story arrives inside this framework wrapped in a chain of transmission that is, when you look at it carefully, almost suspiciously elaborate. The character Critias, based on a real historical figure who was, ironically, one of the most brutal tyrants Athens ever produced, explains how he knows the story. An Athenian statesman named Solon, he says, had traveled to Egypt roughly 2 centuries earlier. Egyptian priests showed Solon their ancient records, revealing events so distant that the Greeks had no memory of them at all. Solon brought this knowledge back to Athens, passed it through the generations of one family, and eventually it reached Critias, who now recounts it to his companions. Think about what that chain actually does. Each step adds distance. Each retelling adds another layer of, I heard this from someone who heard it from someone else. By the time it reaches the reader, the story has passed through 2 centuries, 2 languages, a sea voyage to Egypt, and the memories of at least 5 separate people. If Atlantis turned out to be real, the chain provided ancient credentials. If it turned out to be invented, well, who could trace it back to its source? You cannot cross-examine a dead Egyptian priest. It is exactly how you construct a myth with plausible deniability. Plato just did it more elegantly than most. But the real tell is what the story is actually about. Atlantis is not the hero. Athens is. In Plato's account, it is the ancient, virtuous Athenians who stand up to the Atlantean Empire at the height of its aggression and defeat it. Atlantis is wealthy, militarily dominant, and powerful, and that is precisely the problem. Its divine bloodline grows thinner with every generation as human ambition crowds out the original virtue. The rulers stop caring about justice and start caring about conquest. The gods look down and decide something must be done. Plato is writing about corruption, about what happens to a civilization that confuses power with righteousness, about a society that starts out just and prosperous and slowly hollows itself out, because success breeds arrogance, and arrogance breeds ruin. These themes run through essentially everything Plato ever wrote. The Republic is entirely concerned with the structure of an ideal society and how even perfect systems decay over time. His dialogues return again and again to the tension between divine and human nature, between wisdom and appetite, between leadership that serves justice and leadership that serves itself. Atlantis isn't a detour from those preoccupations, it's another vehicle for them, and here is the sharpest part of it. Plato was writing this at a moment when Athens looked far more like Atlantis than like the heroic Athens in his story. The city had become more aggressive, more imperial, more willing to use violence to expand its reach. Plato had watched his own city execute Socrates. He had seen democracy rot into mob politics. He knew exactly what a civilization in moral decline looked like because he was surrounded by one. He didn't need to invent a warning. He built one out of the shape of his own world, populated it with gods and kings and a drowning island, and left it specific enough to feel like memory. The one thing he never did was say explicitly which it was. He never wrote, "This is a story I invented to make a philosophical point," but he also never wrote, "This is a factual account of a real place." He left it suspended in the space between history and allegory, and that space turned out to be extraordinarily productive. Ancient scholars began arguing immediately. His own student Aristotle dismissed the whole thing as fiction Plato had concocted to illustrate his arguments about government, and then conveniently drowned when he no longer needed it. Others treated it as genuine historical record. Some saw allegory, some saw fact, and crucially, these were people working inside the same culture Plato lived in. 2,400 years later, the argument is still going. Plato set up the most consequential ambiguity in Western literature, possibly without fully realizing it, and every generation since has walked straight into it. So what exactly did he write? Because before any of this, the researchers and the documentaries and the sonar surveys, there is just the text. A few thousand words, most of them in a dialogue called Critias, describing a civilization in enough detail that it feels almost like memory. It starts where all Greek stories start, with a god. Poseidon, god of the sea, claims a remote Atlantic island as his domain. There he finds a mortal woman named Cleito, living alone on a hill after the death of her parents. He falls in love with her, or something close enough to love that the Greeks counted it. He encircles her hill with alternating rings of sea and land to protect her, shaping the landscape itself with his hands, and there they live together and produce 5 pairs of twin sons, 10 princes, 10 bloodlines, 10 kingdoms spread across the island, with the eldest son, Atlas, giving the whole place its name, Atlantis, and the outer ocean beyond too. From the beginning, this is a civilization born with a remarkable advantage. Half divine, these first rulers carry something in their blood that keeps them just. Their laws are inscribed on a pillar of orichalcum, a rare metal Plato describes as gleaming red, worth more than anything except gold, and every 5th year, alternating with every 6th, the 10 kings gather by torchlight, sacrifice a bull, and sit in judgment of one another under those sacred flames, swearing to uphold the code their ancestor Poseidon first set down. Now, the geography. The island sits beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar, the hard boundary between the known Mediterranean world and the open ocean. Plato is explicit about this. Atlantis is not hiding somewhere in the Mediterranean. It sits in the real ocean, the vast outer water, and it is large. Plato describes it as larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, which is a staggering claim. He is describing something closer in scale to a continent than to any island. And within this enormous landmass, the capital city is built around a structure unlike anything else in the ancient world. At the center stands the original hill where Poseidon found Cleito. Around it, the Atlanteans have constructed concentric rings of land and water, alternating moats and landmasses, each ring connected to the next by bridges. The entire system cut through by a deep canal wide enough for the largest ships, running from the outermost ring straight to the heart of the city. At the center, Poseidon's palace, rebuilt and expanded by each generation of kings until it has become almost grotesquely magnificent. The walls are coated in brass, tin, and orichalcum. The innermost temple to Poseidon is covered in silver, its pinnacles tipped in gold. The resources elsewhere on the island are almost embarrassingly abundant. Forests full of timber, meadows supporting vast herds, hot springs and cold springs flowing side by side, gold and silver in the mountains, and elephants, wild elephants roaming freely across the land, which Plato mentions almost in passing, as if it is perfectly unremarkable, a detail that has quietly baffled scholars ever since. The civilization that grows out of all this is, for most of its history, admirable. The navy is unmatched. The army is enormous. Trade reaches into every corner of the known world. But the laws hold, the kings govern justly, and Atlantis flourishes for generation after generation without directing any of that power against its neighbors. Then the dilution begins. Each generation, the divine share of their heritage grows a little thinner. Human nature is patient and persistent, and slowly it crowds out everything the gods put there. The kings stop caring about the orichalcum pillar and start caring about wealth and dominance. They grow restless, aggressive. The hunger for conquest replaces the hunger for justice. And one by one, the old laws start to bend until they begin pressing outward across the sea. Zeus watches this from Olympus and calls the gods to council. And here, in the middle of the Critias dialogue, Plato's pen stops. The text ends mid-sentence. Zeus has assembled the gods, opened his mouth to speak, and the manuscript simply cuts off. What follows is silence. It was never finished. Whether Plato died before completing it or chose to stop for reasons we can no longer recover, nobody knows. We have to reach back to the earlier dialogue, Timaeus, for the conclusion, which tells us only that the gods sent one night of catastrophic earthquakes and flooding, and Atlantis vanished beneath the sea. A single terrible night, gone completely. The moral shape of the story is so clean it practically announces itself. Virtue produces prosperity. Prosperity produces pride. Pride produces corruption. Corruption produces punishment. This is the structure of every cautionary fable in the ancient world, and Plato follows it without deviation. Power corrupts, civilization collapses, the gods restore order. It's not subtle. It's not designed to be. He was not encoding a secret history inside a riddle. He was constructing a moral lesson in the form his audience had been trained since childhood to recognize and absorb. The problem is the sheer amount of detail, the rings, the canal, the specific dimensions Plato gives in Stadia, the precise formula for the law ceremony, the orichalcum, the elephants, the hot springs, the arrangement of the bridges. This is not how you write a philosophical parable. Simple parables don't have engineering specifications. They don't describe the exact metallurgy of temple walls or give a precise timeline for how often kings must sacrifice a bull and reconfirm their oaths. Plato either invented the most convincingly specific fictional civilization in ancient literature, or he built it from scattered fragments of something real. That question, 2,400 years after he first wrote it down, still has no clean answer. The first person to weigh in was the one best positioned to know. Aristotle had studied under Plato for 20 years. He knew his teacher's intellectual habits, his preferred methods, his deep commitment to using narrative as a vehicle for philosophical argument. And his verdict on Atlantis was blunt and immediate, pure invention. The island was a fiction constructed to illustrate arguments about ideal government and the gradual corruption of societies, and then deliberately drowned because drowning it was the cleanest way to ensure nobody could go looking. No ruins to excavate, no geography to cross-check, and no awkward questions from students wondering why none of the Athenian ship captains had ever stumbled across a sunken empire in the Atlantic. The argument had a certain brutal logic to it. If you want to illustrate how a perfect society collapses into ruin, you need an example. A real example brings complications. Living descendants, contested histories, inconvenient facts that refuse to cooperate with the point you're making. An invented example, placed safely in the distant past and then removed from the physical world entirely, leaves nothing to argue with, Atlantis can say exactly what you need it to say, mean exactly what you need it to mean, and vanish before anyone can complicate the lesson. Aristotle essentially argued that Plato was too skillful a writer to be accidentally misunderstood. The story was a tool, nothing more, but not everyone arrived at the same conclusion. Xenocrates, who took over leadership of Plato's academy after his death, treated the Atlantis account as genuine historical tradition. Crantor, one of the first serious commentators on Plato's work, reportedly went further, claiming that Egyptian priests had confirmed to a Greek envoy that their records preserved memory of exactly the events Plato described. Whether that confirmation actually happened or whether someone simply wanted it to be true badly enough that it became reported as fact is now impossible to determine. The ancient world couldn't check, neither can we. The ancient world split almost immediately and stayed split. Strabo discussed Atlantis with visible uncertainty, noting that serious scholars disagreed about whether it was history or fiction, declining to come down decisively in either camp. Proclus, a Neoplatonist writing in the 5th century AD, cited sources claiming Atlantic islands were still inhabited by people preserving memory of a vast empire that once ruled the outer ocean. Pliny and Diodorus gestured toward the same general region in their historical writings without committing to anything definitive. This matters because these were educated men with access to Mediterranean trading networks, to coastal oral traditions, and to each other's writing. If Atlantis was a real place and someone in the ancient world knew where it was, this was the era when that knowledge would have surfaced. It didn't. None of them were doing original research. They were interpreting Plato, borrowing Plato, decorating their own work with the image of a drowned civilization, which is itself telling. Atlantis had become a reference point, something writers reached for when they needed to evoke lost grandeur, a civilization consumed by its own excess. The symbolic value of the story turned out to be enormous even to people who weren't sure any of it was real. But here is what matters. For all those centuries, the argument stayed in the realm of ideas. Raised in academies, debated over wine, written about in treatises almost nobody read. Is the story literal or metaphorical? Did Plato receive genuine Egyptian tradition or fabricate the entire chain of transmission? These were interesting arguments. Serious people had them. What nobody did was go looking. No expedition set sail toward the outer Atlantic searching for ruins. No navigator adjusted his course hunting for orichalcum columns on the ocean floor. The story lived in the world of thought, which is where philosophy is supposed to live. In that world, a thing doesn't need to be physically real to carry truth. Plato's dialogues are full of invented stories doing philosophical work. The allegory of the cave, the myth of air, the chariot of the soul. Nobody chartered ships to find the cave. You read it, extract the meaning, and move on. Atlantis was treated the same way for a very long time. Disputed, occasionally romanticized, sometimes taken as genuine history, but broadly understood as something belonging to the world of ideas rather than geography. Something to debate, not to excavate. That understanding held more or less through the ancient world and into the medieval period, when Plato's works fell largely out of circulation in Western Europe, and Atlantis faded quietly into the background. It would take another 1,000 years and a former American congressman with very large ambitions and very few scholarly constraints to drag it back out and turn it into something considerably more explosive. His name was Ignatius Donnelly, and before he became the man most responsible for the modern Atlantis mythology, he had been a land speculator, a populist politician, a 2-term lieutenant governor of Minnesota, and a congressman who had spent years trying to prove that Francis Bacon wrote Shakespeare's plays. In 1882, he published a book titled Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, and it changed everything. Not because it was good scholarship, it wasn't, but because it arrived at exactly the right moment, written in exactly the right register, confident, sweeping, crammed with evidence from every corner of ancient history, and aimed squarely at a public that was already primed to believe. The timing is worth dwelling on. In 1871, just 11 years before Donnelly's book, a German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann announced that he had found Troy. Troy, the city from Homer's Iliad, the 10-year siege, the wooden horse, had been written off by serious scholars as literary invention, a poet's backdrop. And there it was, buried beneath a hill in northwestern Turkey, real and excavable, a myth with actual walls. That discovery cracked something open in the cultural imagination. If Troy was real, what else might be? If professional academics had been wrong about Homer, maybe they were wrong about other things too. Maybe ancient stories preserved genuine memories that scholars were too dismissive to take seriously. Donnelly walked straight through that door. His argument was staggering in its ambition. Atlantis, he said, was not philosophical allegory. It was the literal origin point of human civilization, the mother culture from which everything descended. The pyramids of Egypt and the pyramids of the Maya weren't separate inventions. They were both inherited from Atlantis. The flood myth appearing in Genesis, in Sumerian texts, in Hindu scripture, in dozens of indigenous traditions across multiple continents. Not coincidence. Memory. Global cultural memory of the actual destruction of an actual place. The gods and giants of Greek mythology, Atlantean kings remembered in legend, the alphabet, metallurgy, agriculture, architecture, all of it flowed outward from a single sunken source. It is the kind of theory that explains everything by proving nothing, and it became a sensation. The book went through dozens of printings. It was read by prime ministers and scientists and ordinary people who had never given Plato a second thought. Donnelly's Atlantis wasn't a philosophical teaching tool or an ancient Greek classroom exercise. It was a lost world, a technological supercivilization, a sunken empire whose destruction had restarted human history from scratch. But the most dangerous thing Donnelly planted wasn't any specific claim about Atlantis, it was the method. His approach rested on the idea that myths contain hidden historical information, and that a sufficiently clever reader, willing to look across cultures, draw connections between symbols, notice similarities that academic specialists with their narrow disciplines would miss, could recover truths that professional historians had buried under their own assumptions. The implication was quiet but unmistakable. Mainstream scholarship was not just incomplete, it was systematically blind. Clever outsiders, thinking freely, could see what insiders refused to look at. That idea turned out to be extraordinarily contagious, and it has been spreading ever since. Helena Blavatsky arrived 6 years later. The founder of the Theosophical Society, Blavatsky published The Secret Doctrine in 1888, a vast and labyrinthine text she claimed had been dictated to her from ancient spiritual records that she traced back to Atlantis itself. Her Atlanteans bore no resemblance to Plato's military aggressors or Donnelly's technologists. They were spiritual masters, closer to gods than humans, possessing wisdom so profound that its fragments still survived in every major religious tradition if you knew how to read them. Blavatsky's Atlantis was less a physical civilization than a cosmic lineage, and her followers absorbed it into a rich spiritual framework that blended Eastern mysticism, Western occultism, and a deep conviction that modern materialism had cut humanity off from something ancient, an essential. Where Donnelly had secularized Atlantis, Blavatsky sanctified it. Then came Edgar Cayce. In the 1920s and 1930s, a psychic from Kentucky named Edgar Cayce gave thousands of trance readings for clients seeking medical advice and spiritual guidance. A significant number of those readings involved Atlantis. Cayce claimed that many of his subjects had lived past lives there, and in these sessions he described Atlantis in remarkable detail. Its energy technology, its crystals, its spiritual practices, its collapse. He also made predictions. Atlantis, he said, would physically rise from the ocean again around 1969. It did not. But the 1960s and 1970s saw a wave of Atlantis enthusiasm anyway, partly fueled by Cayce's prophecy, partly by the cultural disruption of the era, partly because a strange rock formation was discovered underwater near the Bahamas in 1968 that some people immediately declared was an Atlantean road. By this point, something fundamental had happened to the story. Plato's Atlantis and the popular Atlantis had become two completely different things, occupying the same name. Plato's version was a philosophical allegory about the corruption of power, set in a specific narrative context intended for a specific audience, making a specific argument. The popular version was something else entirely, a complete alternative history of the world, a lost golden age of spiritual and technological achievement, an explanation for every cultural parallel and every flood myth and every pyramid-shaped structure on every continent. It had its own literature, its own prophets, its own internal logic, and millions of believers. None of them had read much Plato. They had read Donnelly or Blavatsky or Casey or the writers and filmmakers who built on top of all three. What started as one philosopher's teaching device had grown into an entire parallel mythology. And unlike Plato's version, this one actively encouraged people to go searching. Among all the theories about where Atlantis might actually be, and there are dozens, most collapse quickly under the weight of basic facts. The wrong ocean, the wrong era, the wrong scale, the wrong everything. But there is one that doesn't collapse, one that has genuine scientific weight behind it and has attracted serious archaeologists and geologists, not just enthusiasts with sonar equipment and a book to sell. It starts in the Aegean Sea, roughly 5,000 years ago, with a civilization that most people have never heard of. The Minoans were Europe's first great civilization. Based primarily on the island of Crete, with settlements scattered across the Aegean islands, they were building multi-story structures and laying paved roads while most of the European continent was still organized around small farming villages. They had a written language, Linear A, which archaeologists still cannot fully decipher. Their drainage systems and indoor plumbing were more sophisticated than anything in Europe until the Roman period, roughly 1,500 years later. Their art was extraordinary, vivid frescoes covering palace walls, depicting acrobats and sea creatures and women in elaborate formal dress, with a confidence and vitality that still feels alive. And they were sailors, exceptional ones. Their trading networks stretched across the Mediterranean, reaching Egypt to the south and mainland Greece to the north, moving copper, tin, pottery, and textiles across hundreds of miles of open water. One of their important island settlements was a place called Thera. We know it today as Santorini, the famous crescent-shaped island in the southern Aegean, beloved by tourists draped in white-walled buildings above volcanic cliffs. In the Bronze Age, it was a roughly circular island with a volcano at its center, home to a prosperous Minoan community that traded, farmed, and built with the same ambition and skill as the rest of the civilization. Around 1600 BC, the volcano erupted. This was not a routine eruption. Geologists believe it may rank among the most powerful volcanic explosions in all of recorded human history, comparable in scale to Krakatoa, possibly larger. It ejected an almost incomprehensible volume of rock and ash into the atmosphere, sent tsunamis rolling across the entire Aegean, and then did something uniquely catastrophic. The explosion emptied the magma chamber beneath the island. With nothing supporting them from below, enormous sections of Thera simply dropped, collapsed vertically into the sea. The circular island became a flooded caldera, the drowned bowl-shaped depression that still defines Santorini's geography today. The tsunamis reached Crete. The evidence is embedded in the archaeological record: thick ash deposits, destroyed coastal settlements, the sudden end of several Minoan palace complexes. A civilization that had flourished for centuries was shattered within a generation. Whether the eruption alone finished the Minoans or whether outside invaders moved in to finish the job is still debated, but the disruption was catastrophic and total. Now, the details that have made archaeologists genuinely pause. Plato describes the diameter of Atlantis' central island as approximately 100 stadia, which works out to roughly 11 miles. Santorini, before its collapse, had a diameter of about 10 miles. That's close enough to be striking. He also describes the layout of the capital, a central hill surrounded by concentric rings of alternating land and water. Santorini's volcanic structure, prior to the caldera collapse, essentially produced this layout naturally. The central peak rising from the island, ringed by the coastline with the surrounding sea completing the concentric pattern. Then there is Akrotiri. Buried under volcanic ash and only discovered by archaeologists in 1967, Akrotiri is the closest thing the ancient world has to a second Pompeii. An entire Minoan town sealed intact beneath meters of pumice. Multi-story buildings still standing, elaborate frescoes preserved on the interior walls, images of fishing boats, of blue monkeys, of young men boxing, of a detailed coastal map painting showing a town with extraordinary geographic specificity. Advanced drainage channels running beneath the streets, sophisticated urban planning in a Bronze Age settlement that simply vanished one morning in the mid-16th century BC. No bodies have been found at Akrotiri. The residents apparently had enough warning to evacuate. The parallels with Plato's account are real enough that serious researchers take this theory seriously. Egyptian records of the Thera catastrophe almost certainly existed. Egypt maintained meticulous administrative archives, and those records would have filtered westward through Mediterranean trading networks over the following centuries. Solon supposedly visited Egypt around 590 BC. That's roughly 1,000 years after Thera's destruction. A disaster of that magnitude, one that devastated maritime trade across the entire eastern Mediterranean, would not have been forgotten. The theory at its most reasonable runs like this. Egyptian memory of the Thera eruption reached Plato through the exact channels he describes: the priests, the Solon story, the chain of transmission. He took the outline of a real catastrophe, a sophisticated island civilization destroyed suddenly by geological violence, and built his allegory around it. The drowned island becomes Atlantis. The scale gets inflated to suit the philosophical stakes. The location shifts from the Aegean to the outer Atlantic, placing it safely beyond the edge of the known world. But here is where the theory runs out of road. Plato places Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean, explicitly beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Thera is in the Aegean, well inside the Mediterranean. His timeline puts the destruction 9,000 years before Solon's visit, around 9,600 BC. The Thera eruption happened around 1600 BC. That is an 8,000-year gap. And the scale is entirely different. Plato's island is larger than North Africa and Turkey combined, while Thera before its collapse was 10 miles across. None of those discrepancies are small. You can't adjust your way around them. What the Santorini theory actually establishes is something more modest and more interesting, that Plato may have known about a real event and used it, that his story has a historical heartbeat buried inside its philosophical architecture. That doesn't make Atlantis real. It makes Plato a far more interesting writer than people who spend their time arguing about ocean floor coordinates tend to give him credit for. The Santorini theory at least has real archaeology behind it. Actual ruins, actual geological evidence, actual scholarly consensus that something catastrophic happened in the Aegean 3,500 years ago. Most Atlantis theories have none of that. What they have is a satellite image or a rock formation or a stretch of underwater seabed that resembles one element of Plato's description from the right angle, and a willingness to treat that resemblance as confirmation. Take the Rishat structure. In the Mauritanian Sahara, roughly 500 kilometers from the nearest ocean, sits a geological formation that from high altitude looks remarkably like Plato's concentric layout. A series of rings, a raised center. The proportions from space are genuinely striking. When someone posted the satellite photograph next to a diagram of Plato's capital city online, it spread everywhere within days. Documentaries followed. YouTube channels with millions of subscribers declared the mystery solved. The Rishat structure is in the middle of a desert. It was shaped by erosion acting on ancient rock formations over hundreds of millions of years. It has no connection to any human civilization. Plato describes an island. The Rishat structure has been a land formation for longer than the human species has existed. But it has the rings, and that is all it needs to have. Once you are actively looking for concentric circles, they appear in deserts, in ocean floors, in geological maps of half the world. The Caribbean produced its own version of this. In 1968, a diver near the Bahamas found a long row of large, flat limestone blocks resting on the ocean floor, remarkably regular, raising the immediate possibility of a constructed road or wall. It became known as the Bimini Road and attracted Atlantis claims almost immediately, particularly from people who remembered Edgar Cayce's 1930s prediction that Atlantis would rise near the Bahamas around 1969. The whole region already carried a mystical reputation as the Bermuda Triangle, which primed certain audiences to find significance in anything unusual beneath those warm, shallow waters. Geologists concluded the formation was natural, beach rock fracturing in predictable patterns as it cools and settles, well documented throughout that part of the world. The straight cracks between the blocks are geology, not masonry. Underwater formations near Cuba received similar treatment in the early 2000s, when sonar scans appeared to show geometric structures on the seafloor. Researchers speculated about walls, roads, a drowned city. Further analysis found no evidence of anything built by human hands. Antarctica has its own adherents. The theory the continent was once temperate and a catastrophic shift in Earth's rotational axis repositioned it from a habitable zone to its current polar one, burying an advanced civilization under miles of ice. Some versions incorporate the Piri Reis map, a 16th century Ottoman chart that supposedly depicts Antarctica before its official discovery, as evidence of Atlantean geographic knowledge surviving into the medieval period. The appeal is partly that Antarctica is inaccessible enough that you cannot easily be proved wrong. A civilization buried under 3 kilometers of ice is conveniently impossible to excavate. Geologists note that Antarctica has been covered in ice for roughly 30 million years. The Piri Reis map, when examined carefully, appears to depict a distorted version of South America's southern coast. The pole shift mechanism required for the theory in the magnitude the theory demands has no credible physical basis. None of this has stopped it from generating books, documentaries, and a dedicated international following. Then there is the Mediterranean sweep: Cyprus, Sardinia, Malta, Sicily, Crete. Each has had its moment over the past century. Malta has ancient megalithic temples older than Stonehenge. Sardinia has thousands of mysterious Bronze Age stone towers. Cyprus has Bronze Age harbor sites and a geography some researchers find suggestive. Every one of them can be made to match something in Plato's account if you approach the matching with sufficient determination and selective attention. And now, the most recent case. At the Cosmic Summit 2025, a research team presented sonar and LiDAR survey results from off the coast of Cadiz in southern Spain. Their data, they said, showed submerged concentric walls rising over 6 meters from the seafloor, possible tower foundations, structures they identified as the Temple of Poseidon, evidence of tsunami deposits consistent with catastrophic flooding. Skeptical archaeologists pointed out that the coastal zone around Cadiz is one of the most thoroughly documented ancient maritime trading areas in the Western Mediterranean. Phoenicians, Greeks, and Romans all operated extensively in the region across thousands of years. Submerged structures in southern Spanish waters are not unusual, and attributing them to Atlantis requires ignoring every civilization that demonstrably operated there. No independent verification has changed any of those assessments. The pattern running through all of it, the Richat structure, the Bimini Road, Cuba, Antarctica, Cadiz, is identical. Each theory identifies the features that match Plato and presents them as evidence. The ones that don't fit simply get dropped. When the concentric ring layout fits but the ocean is wrong, the researcher reinterprets what Plato meant by the Pillars of Hercules. When the timeline is off by 8,000 years, the dating gets reinterpreted. When the scale is completely different, the scale discrepancy disappears from the argument entirely. This is not how evidence works. This is how belief works. Evidence constrains what you can conclude. Belief adjusts the constraints until the conclusion you already want becomes reachable. Every Atlantis search since Donnelly published his book has started with a location and worked backward to Plato. The text bends to fit the site, and every generation finishes convinced they were the ones who nearly cracked it. All of this searching, all the competing theories and sonar surveys and conference presentations runs into the same wall eventually. Not a philosophical wall, not a textual ambiguity or a gap in the historical record. A geological one. The Earth's crust moves. It has been moving for billions of years, and geologists understand the mechanism in extraordinary detail. The Atlantic Ocean floor is formed by a process called seafloor spreading, the mid-Atlantic ridge. Running roughly down the center of the ocean from north to south is a seam where 2 tectonic plates are slowly pulling apart. As they separate, magma wells up from below, solidifies, and becomes new oceanic crust. The plates drift outward from the ridge in both directions, carrying the ocean floor with them, and the Atlantic basin grows a few centimeters wider every year. The entire process works in only one direction, outward, building. Nothing goes down. This process does not create depressions. It does not produce gaps where continents can drop through. It does the opposite. It generates new rock, pushing everything gradually outward. The oldest oceanic crust in the Atlantic, found along the continental margins, is roughly 200 million years old. The crust near the mid-Atlantic ridge is geologically young, still cooling. Every square meter of the Atlantic seafloor has a known origin, a known age, and a known mechanism of formation. There is no room in any of this for a sunken continent. A landmass the size Plato describes, larger than North Africa and Turkey combined, sitting somewhere in the Atlantic between the Strait of Gibraltar and the Americas, would leave an unmistakable geological signature. Continental crust is fundamentally different from oceanic crust. It's thicker, less dense, composed of different materials. If a continent of that scale had existed in the Atlantic and then sunk, the evidence would be written into the seafloor in a way that no amount of time could erase. Modern oceanography has mapped the entire Atlantic floor in three-dimensional detail. Sonar surveys, satellite gravity measurements, deep-sea drilling programs, between them, they have cataloged every ridge, canyon, seamount, and sediment plain in the ocean. The seafloor where Atlantis was supposed to sit is ancient oceanic crust, sitting exactly where plate tectonics says it should be, with no trace of any continental material anywhere it shouldn't exist. This isn't absence of evidence, it's the presence of evidence for something else entirely. A seafloor built exactly as modern geology predicts, with nothing out of place. The standard Atlantis response is that the mapping must be incomplete, or that a catastrophe of sufficient violence could erase all traces, or that the continent sank so rapidly that nothing survives. But none of those arguments hold up against the actual data. Seafloor sediment cores go back millions of years. Gravity surveys reveal what lies beneath the rock. The Atlantic has been measured from surface to basement, and the conclusion is the same everywhere. No sunken continent, no missing landmass, nothing that was ever there and isn't anymore. Now, the nuance worth having. The Earth does produce dramatic local geological events, and some of them are violent enough to permanently alter coastlines within human timescales. Volcanic islands collapse into the sea, Santorini being the obvious example. Earthquakes cause coastal subsidence, dropping ancient settlements into the water. Tsunamis reshape shorelines in hours. Sea levels have risen and fallen dramatically across human prehistory, swallowing coastal settlements that once stood above the waterline. There are genuinely drowned ancient sites sitting in shallow water around the Mediterranean, cities and harbors consumed by rising sea levels or sudden seismic shifts. Real places, real losses, findable in some cases by real archaeology. That kind of local catastrophe is exactly why the Santorini theory has any traction at all. A 10-mile island partially collapsing into the sea after a volcanic eruption. That is something the Earth does, something that fits inside the existing science without stretching anything. But it is not what Plato describes, and it is certainly not what the Atlantis search is actually looking for. The people scanning the floor off Cadiz or pointing at the reshot structure from orbit or arguing about ice cores in Antarctica, they are not looking for a drowned volcanic island the size of Santorini. They are looking for an empire, a civilization larger than a continent, a superpower that ruled the Atlantic and left nothing behind. That thing, geology says with complete confidence, never existed, not in the Atlantic, not anywhere that the ocean has been mapped and measured and analyzed down to its oldest crust. The seafloor is not a mystery. It has been read and understood, layer by layer, in enough detail that the absence of a lost continent is not a gap in the data. It is the data, so the ocean has been mapped, the geology is settled, and the case is closed, at least in the sense that scientific inquiry can close anything. And yet the searches continue. The conferences keep running, the documentaries keep getting commissioned. Every few years, someone announces they've found it, the media briefly cares, and the story fades until the next announcement. Something is clearly not being answered by the geological verdict. The question worth sitting with is not whether Atlantis was real. The evidence on that is overwhelming and one-directional. The question is why the story survives the evidence, why the human appetite for Atlantis appears completely untouched by everything geology and archaeology have established about it. Every culture on Earth carries some version of this. The ancient Greeks described formal ages, gold, silver, bronze, iron, each one a step down from the last, each generation more degraded than the one before. Humanity descended from heroes who descended from gods, and the world simply wasn't what it used to be. Hindu cosmology describes vast cycles of divine civilization stretching back almost incomprehensible distances, each epoch ending in collapse and renewal. The biblical flood erases a world that existed before a prior humanity drowned so the world could start again. Norse tradition has its golden age before Ragnarok, when the gods still walked and the world ran as it was supposed to. Almost every major mythological tradition carries the same basic structure. Something better existed, it was lost, and what we have now is the diminished aftermath. Plato knew this structure and built Atlantis directly inside it. The genius is how precisely the story matches what people already believed about the past. It didn't need to be true to feel true, it just needed to have the right shape. When the present feels chaotic or morally corrupted or simply smaller than it should be, humans look backward and imagine something larger was there. It is one of the most persistent patterns in recorded history, the conviction that a golden age preceded the current one, that wisdom and power once existed at a scale that has since been lost. Atlantis is the Western world's most fully developed version of that instinct, complete with a specific island, a founding god, a strict moral code, and a catastrophic end. But here is the sharpest irony in the entire story. Plato's warning was specifically aimed at the kind of civilization that believes itself exceptional and immune to the usual laws of collapse. Atlantis was wealthy, powerful, militarily dominant, and it fell precisely because it confused those advantages with virtue. It mistook strength for righteousness. The very qualities that made it impressive are what destroyed it. Plato was writing about pride, its seductions, and its consequences. And the response, across 2,400 years, has been to build a mythology around Atlantis that describes it as the most exceptional civilization in human history. More advanced than the Egyptians, more spiritually refined than anything that followed. The secret ancestor of all civilization, the great lost source whose absence explains every mysterious structure, every cultural parallel, every ancient achievement the modern world struggles to account for. We took his warning about the dangers of believing you're special and turned it into a religion about a supremely special place. There is also a quieter problem running underneath all of this, one that rarely gets discussed alongside the geological questions. When someone argues that the pyramids required a lost civilization to design them, or that the megaliths at Göbekli Tepe are beyond what prehistoric communities could have achieved independently, the implication, usually unstated, is that the people who actually built those things couldn't have done it without outside help. That Egyptians didn't really build the pyramids, that the ancient communities of Anatolia couldn't have raised Göbekli Tepe on their own, that the actual human beings living in the actual historical periods where the evidence places them were somehow less capable than the record shows. The Minoans built multi-story cities and ran a maritime trading empire across the Mediterranean. The Sumerians developed writing, codified law, and organized urban planning from scratch. The people who raised the great Egyptian monuments were surveyors, engineers, administrators, and craftsmen of extraordinary skill, and we know their names, their wages, their working conditions, and where they lived, because the Egyptians wrote all of it down. These are not mysterious achievements, they are documented ones. The mystery is not how they were built. The mystery is why that explanation keeps feeling like it isn't enough. There are real lost cities, genuinely forgotten places mentioned in ancient texts and dismissed as legend that turned out to be entirely real. Thonis Herakleion, an Egyptian port city referenced in ancient sources and written off by most scholars for centuries, was found in 2000 sitting in the shallow waters of Abukir Bay off the Egyptian coast. Temples, statues, anchors, coins, intact ceramics, the physical residue of a thriving city that was active when Solon visited Egypt and had sunk quietly into the sea long before anyone went looking. It was found by a French underwater archaeologist named Frank Gaudio using methodical sonar surveys and patient fieldwork, not by someone following Plato, by someone doing archaeology. The real lost world is being recovered piece by piece by researchers willing to accept that ancient people were capable and left real evidence behind. Every decade of serious underwater work turns up something extraordinary. The past is genuinely strange and genuinely vast without any help from a sunken Atlantic empire. Plato almost certainly didn't intend any of this. He wrote a story with a specific philosophical purpose, gave it enough concrete detail to feel vivid and real, embedded it in a narrative chain designed to give it ancient authority, and left the ending unfinished. Whether the Critias dialogue was cut short by his death or abandoned for reasons we'll never recover, nobody knows. But that unfinished sentence, Zeus assembling the gods and opening his mouth to speak and then silence, may be the single most consequential fragment of text in Western literary history. He left a door open and nobody has been able to close it since. Every generation walks through it convinced they are the first to take the question seriously. Every new technology, sonar, satellite imagery, LiDAR, deep-sea robotics, becomes a fresh reason to try again. The sophistication of the search grows steadily. The underlying motivation stays identical. The refusal to accept that something this detailed, this specific, this completely vivid could simply have been invented. That might be the strangest tribute any philosopher has ever received. Plato spent his life arguing that the visible world is a shadow of something deeper, that appearances deceive, that surfaces conceal truths only careful thought can reach, that things which seem invented often carry the deepest reality. He built his entire career on the distinction between what seems real and what actually is. Then he wrote a story about a civilization consumed by its own arrogance, sank it beneath the ocean, and watched posterity spend 2.5 millennia insisting it must be real. He would have found that either deeply ironic or entirely predictable, probably both.